Welcome to Lost Scrolls Archive, tonight's journey. Whether you listening to this story in the quiet of your room, or amid the distant hum of the modern world, allow yourself a few moments to slow down, because tonight we are stepping into one of the most mysterious and most misunderstood traditions in the history of Europe and the Middle East, the 72 Demons of Solomon. For centuries, these names have been copied into aging manuscripts, whispered within monastery walls, and passed down as symbols of invisible fears that human language struggled to contain. At the center of these stories stands Solomon, the king renowned for wisdom and order, whom legend claims could command forces beyond the human world. But what we are about to explore is not ritual or spellcraft. It is the history of texts, of belief, and of how ancient societies tried to impose structure on chaos through lists, names, and symbols. This is a story told slowly, grounded in verified sources, to understand why the 72 demons once came into being, and why they continue to haunt our imagination even today. When we speak of Solomon, we often find ourselves standing before two overlapping figures. One is the Solomon of religious history, the king associated with wisdom, justice, and the construction of the temple. The other is the Solomon of legend, the bearer of the ring, the one who names invisible forces and compels chaos to submit to order. To understand why the tradition of the 72 demons became attached to Solomon, we must patiently separate these two figures, not to set them against each other, but to see how they eventually converged within the human imagination. In the Hebrew Bible, Solomon is not introduced as a magician or a wielder of supernatural power. He appears first and foremost as an ideal ruler situated within the political and moral imagination of ancient Israel. His wisdom stands at the center of the narrative, especially in the books of Kings and Chronicles, as the foundation of a stable social order. The famous story of the two women disputing a child is not meant to display clever trickery, but to emphasize something profoundly practical: the ability to perceive human motives and to discern truth in situations where rigid law alone is insufficient. Crucially, Solomon's wisdom in the biblical texts is not mystical. It does not arise from spells or miracles, but is described as a gift bound to the responsibility of governance. Solomon asks for understanding so that he may judge the people, and that wisdom manifests through administration, diplomacy, legal judgment, and social organization. He embodies an ancient belief that order can be sustained through insight and discernment, not merely through military force or punishment. The temple associated with Solomon follows the same logic in the Bible. The temple is not simply a place of worship, it is the stabilizing axis of the world, a fixed point where heaven, earth, and community converge. Its construction is described with painstaking detail: dimensions, materials, rituals, and procedures, all reflecting a desire to place the chaos of human life into a structure that can be understood and maintained. In this role, Solomon is not a conqueror of darkness, but an organizer of the world. It is precisely this image, a king who uses understanding to create order, that allowed later traditions to attach additional roles to Solomon. When subsequent generations faced forms of instability that law and reason could no longer fully explain, they returned to this familiar symbol and extended it into the invisible realm. But to understand the legendary Solomon, one must first remember the biblical Solomon, not a sorcerer, but a model of the belief that wisdom can prevent the world from collapsing. Yet history rarely remains confined to a single layer of meaning. As centuries passed and the world changed faster than human understanding could keep pace, Solomon began to assume another role. He became a name, an authority label in ancient and medieval manuscript culture. Attributing a text to a revered figure was not deception in the modern sense. It was a way of saying, what is written here belongs to the tradition of wisdom. For this reason, many works composed long after Solomon's lifetime were written under his name. This phenomenon, known in scholarship as pseudepigraphy, produced a second Solomon, the Solomon of literature and symbol. This legendary Solomon is no longer merely a king, adjudicating disputes among humans. He becomes a dialogue partner with the invisible, a figure created when the world grew too complex to be explained by law and moral reasoning alone. In later narratives, reality extends beyond what can be seen and touched. It includes nameless forces, illness without clear cause, mental disturbances that strip individuals of control, waves of collective violence that rise and subside, and forbidden desires that cannot simply be erased. When science did not yet exist as an explanatory system, humans did not tolerate emptiness. They personified what they could not understand, turning it into entities with names, intentions, and purposes. Naming was not merely a linguistic act. It was a psychological effort to transform vague fear into something that could be addressed, spoken to, and at least in imagination controlled. And to prevent these names from becoming absolute threats, they had to be placed under the authority of a sufficiently powerful symbol of order. Solomon, whose intellectual authority had already been established by scripture, became the almost inevitable choice. What is striking is that in most of these traditions, Solomon does not battle the invisible forces. He does not drive them away with violence. Nor does he annihilate them to restore order. Instead, he governs them. He summons them, asks their names, inquires into their functions, how they cause harm, and how they may be constrained. This approach reflects a logic deeply familiar to organized societies. When a problem cannot be eliminated, it must be regulated. This is not the logic of war, but the logic of administration and law. The legendary Solomon functions as an ideal ruler within the ancient imagination. He compiles lists, classifies dangers, defines spheres of influence, and assigns each entity a place within the overall order. The invisible world, as shaped by later authors, is organized like a parallel court to human society, complete with ranks, functions, and authority, mirroring the way humans structure their own governments. It is precisely this mirroring that gives the Solomon legends their durability. They are not merely stories about demons or spirits. They are stories about how humans imagine order. When illness, desire, or violence is described as an entity that can be named and managed, ancient societies gain a temporary sense of security. The world still has structure, even in its darkest regions. In this role, Solomon is not a conqueror of darkness, but one who imposes form upon chaos, transforming fear into something that can be written down, discussed, and linguistically controlled. At this point, history and legend meet. The historical Solomon represents an ancient dream, that order can be established. The legendary Solomon extends that dream into domains humans cannot control. When plagues spread, when madness is understood as intrusion, when morality is threatened by desire, people did not only pray, they wrote names, they wrote catalogues, they wrote systems. For this reason, Solomon commanding demons should not be read as a simple supernatural claim. It is a historical metaphor for how societies confront uncertainty rather than accepting chaos as an empty void. Humans fill it with language and symbol. Solomon, endowed with intellectual authority, becomes the center of this process under his name. Later texts could speak about fear without destabilizing existing religious order, because everything had been placed under the authority of the wise king. This leads to a natural question. If the historical Solomon left no text describing 72 demons, why did the tradition take such deep root? The answer lies in social need. Every era has its characteristic fears, and every era finds its own way to express them. When Europe and the Middle East entered periods of upheaval, plague, religious conflict, moral crisis, the need to name and control evil became urgent. Solomon, as a symbol of wisdom and order, was the perfect vessel. This chapter, therefore, does not end by drawing a hard line between truth and fiction. It ends with a softer realization. History and legend do not cancel each other out. They overlap in order to serve different human needs. The historical Solomon offers a model of justice. The legendary Solomon offers a linguistic tool for confronting fear. And from the intersection of these two figures, texts such as the Testament of Solomon, which we will explore in the next chapter, begin to take shape, opening the path toward the list later generations would call the 72 demons. If you are listening in the night, notice one small thing. The most enduring stories rarely survive because they are literally true, but because they are useful. They help humans endure the dark spaces of incomplete knowledge, and for many centuries, the name Solomon fulfilled exactly that role, a symbolic lamp illuminating both history and legend. Before we move deeper into the shadows of the ancient texts themselves, if in the previous chapter Solomon still stood at the boundary between history and legend, then in this chapter we step fully into a different space, the space of texts. Here, Solomon is no longer remembered through collective memory or biblical stories recited in ritual, but through manuscripts that were copied, revised, and passed from hand to hand over many centuries. At the center of this journey stands the Testament of Solomon, a work that exists on the margins of religious orthodoxy, yet exerted a profound influence on later traditions concerning Solomon and the invisible forces. The first point that must be stated clearly is that the Testament of Solomon does not belong to the Bible. It is not a doctrinal text, nor is it recognized as inspired scripture by either Judaism or mainstream Christianity. Scholars classify it as pseudepigrapha, texts attributed to a famous figure from the past in order to borrow symbolic authority rather than to reflect genuine historical authorship. Most scholars agree that this work exists in multiple editorial layers, with an initial core, likely formed in late antiquity, and subsequently expanded and modified over the centuries. The version known today was transmitted primarily in Greek, and survives in several variant manuscripts, none of which are entirely consistent in detail or structure. It is precisely this layered nature that makes the Testament of Solomon distinctive. It does not reflect the worldview of a single historical moment, but resembles a recording, extended across generations, in which different communities left their marks. Within the text, we see an intersection of Jewish tradition, early Christian thought, Greek philosophy, ancient astrology, and popular conceptions of illness and psychology. This is not a neatly divided world, but a cultural space where ideas overlap, blend, and at times contradict one another. The structure of the Testament of Solomon differs greatly from modern notions of a book of exorcism. It does not present rituals, provide instructions for summoning, or offer technical formulas for practice. Instead, it operates as a series of interrogations. Solomon, granted a seal that symbolizes authority, summons invisible beings one by one before him. He does not shout, engage in combat, or employ violence. He asks questions, and those questions follow a pattern that is almost administrative in her nature. Who are you? How do you harm humans? By what means can you be constrained? Here the beings labeled as demons do not represent absolute evil, nor do they function as complete opposites to God in the later theological sense. They possess specific functions. Some cause insomnia and chronic exhaustion. Others bring headaches, physical weakness, or prolonged states of melancholy. Still others are associated with desire, jealousy, or uncontrollable impulses. Each confession resembles a brief case file in which fear is transformed into information. It is at this point that the Testament of Solomon reveals its particular historical value. The text should not be read as a manual of magic, but as an attempt to explain the world in a pre-scientific context. Before germ theory could explain disease, before psychology could describe depression or obsession, people still had to live with these phenomena. Personification, turning experiences into entities with names and intentions, was one of humanity's oldest tools for coping with uncertainty. A sickness once named no longer seemed entirely random. A fear once described became less boundless. In the Testament of Solomon, Solomon is not a sorcerer destroying evil, but a collector of knowledge. By compelling these beings to describe themselves, he turns the invisible into an object of language. And in many ancient cultures, language itself was power. What can be named can be discussed. What can be discussed no longer lies completely beyond control. Here, Solomon's authority lies not in miracles, but in his ability to impose structure upon chaos. Another important aspect of the text is the intellectual synthesis it displays. Alongside clear Jewish elements, the figure of Solomon, the temple, authority granted by God, the Testament of Solomon also bears the imprint of Greek astrology and ancient medicine. Certain entities are associated with stars, temporal cycles, or specific natural conditions. This reflects a worldview in which illness, emotion, and fate are inseparable from cosmic order. Ancient societies did not sharply distinguish between psychological, physical, and cosmic realms. All were understood as different expressions of the same underlying structure. Because of this hybrid character, the Testament of Solomon does not present a fixed list. The number and names of entities vary across manuscripts. There is no stable total of 72. Instead, the text functions as an open collection, allowing each generation of scribes to add, remove, or modify material according to its own context. This suggests that the purpose of the text was not to produce a definitive classification, but to offer a framework for understanding fear. Another way to approach the Testament of Solomon is to read it as a map of social anxiety. Entities that cause debilitation reflect fears surrounding health in a world without adequate medicine. Those associated with desire and jealousy reflect moral tensions within the community. Entities tied to violence and chaos reflect anxieties about political and social instability. All of these forces are gathered under Solomon's authority, not to deny their existence, but to situate them within an intelligible order. Solomon's seal, though existing only within the narrative, carries deep symbolic meaning. In the ancient world, a seal was not decorative. It was a marker of administrative authority. A document held no force unless it bore a legitimate seal. When Solomon uses his seal to summon invisible beings, he acts as the supreme administrator of both the visible and invisible realms. This reflects how ancient societies conceived power. True authority does not need to destroy. It must be recognized and obeyed. Yet, the Testament of Solomon is not a story of total victory. In some passages, Solomon appears firmly in control. In others, he reveals vulnerability, even failure before the very forces he seeks to manage. These contradictions are not flaws in the text, but evidence of a profound awareness. Humanly constructed order is always imperfect. Naming and classifying fear does not eliminate it. It merely allows people to live alongside it in a more structured way. It is precisely this tension that made the Testament of Solomon foundational for later traditions. Medieval and early modern authors would adopt its model of interrogation, classification, management, and push it further, making it more detailed, more rigid. An open collection gradually became a list. Flexible descriptions became hierarchical systems, and from this process, the idea of a fixed number eventually identified as 72 began to take shape before moving into that later phase. However, it is essential to pause with the Testament of Solomon long enough to grasp its core spirit. This is not a text designed to spread fear, but one that domesticates fear through writing. It captures a moment in history when humans facing an uncertain world chose not to remain silent. They wrote down what troubled them. They asked questions. They recorded answers. And in doing so, they created a sense that the world, however dark, could still be understood. If not completely, then at least in part. In the next chapter, we will leave the Hellenized space of the Testament of Solomon and enter another tradition, Rabbinic Judaism, where the image of Solomon continues to evolve. There, the story of the ring, authority, and invisible forces takes on a new tone, both familiar and distinct, revealing yet another way humans confronted the same enduring fear. If the Testament of Solomon gives us a Solomon shaped by a Hellenized world where fear is written into texts and arranged like case files, then Rabbinic Jewish tradition moves Solomon into a different space altogether. Here he no longer stands at the center of an invisible court, interrogating a succession of beings. Instead, he confronts a single figure who concentrates the story's full tension within himself. Ashmedai, often later identified with Asmodeus in subsequent traditions, The primary source for this narrative lies in the Talmud, especially in Gittin 68a to b. Unlike pseudepigraph works that present a continuous self-contained story, the Talmud is a complex compilation of debates, legends, legal material, and commentary. For that reason, the Solomon Ashmedai account is not told as a complete myth from beginning to end. It appears as a fragment woven into rabbitic argumentation. Yet, it is precisely this form that reveals with particular clarity how ancient Jewish thought understood the relationship between power, wisdom, and disorder. In this tradition, Ashai is not simply a demon in a simplified moral sense. He is described as the king of demons, an entity endowed with intelligence, language, and reasoning, capable at times of arguments that make listeners hesitate. Ashai does not embody blind evil or meaningless chaos. He represents a counterforce to the order constructed by human beings. Accordingly, the confrontation between Solomon and Ashdai is not a contest of physical strength, but a game of power and intellect, where each move raises questions about the legitimacy of order itself. In the rabbinic story, Solomon needs Ashmedai in order to complete the building of the temple, not because he lacks labor or tools, but because there are materials and procedures that humans cannot handle without violating divine law. This reveals a central paradox within Jewish thought. Certain sacred goals are so elevated that they cannot be achieved solely through pure human means. Ashai in this context is positioned as a source of knowledge that is both dangerous and necessary. Solomon does not seek to destroy him, he seeks to make use of him. This is a recurring motif in rabbitic reasoning. Disorder cannot be erased entirely. It must be engaged cautiously with a clear awareness of moral risk. The way Solomon restrains Ashai reflects that very logic. There is no spectacular magic, no secret ritual. What grants Solomon authority is the ring, a symbol of legitimacy bestowed by God. The ring does not annihilate Ashai. It compels him to acknowledge the order Solomon represents. Here, power does not come from personal strength or clever tricks, but from legitimacy. Solomon prevails not because he is stronger, but because he stands within an order recognized as lawful. The subtlety of this tradition lies in the fact that such acknowledgement is not permanent. The ring is the condition of authority. Once that condition is removed, authority collapses. Ashai can be compelled to submit, yet he can also reverse the order when the symbol of legitimacy falls from Solomon's hand. The narrative therefore does not celebrate absolute domination. It emphasizes the fragility of power. Order exists only when maintained properly within its proper limits. At a deeper level, Ashmedai functions as a moral test for Solomon. Using dangerous knowledge to achieve a sacred goal raises a hard question. Where is the boundary between use and abuse? Rabbitic tradition offers no easy answer. Instead, it tells a story in which Solomon, despite his wisdom, can still err when he believes he has fully controlled disorder. Ashai exists to remind us that no order is immune to self-satisfaction. For this reason, the figure of Ashai does more than enrich Solomon's legend. He deepens rabbitic Jewish reflection on power itself. Disorder is not something that can be destroyed. It is always present, waiting to be named, managed. And if humans are careless to seize the place of order in the game between Solomon and Ashai, what is at stake is not a temporary victory or defeat, but the limits of human wisdom when facing forces beyond full control. Yet the story does not end with Solomon's triumph, and this is precisely where rabbitic tradition differs sharply from later magical literature. In the Talmud, the balance of power is reversed. Ashai, by cunning, obtains the ring. Once the symbol of authority slips from Solomon's grasp, everything changes. The wise king is driven from the throne, wandering like an anonymous man. While Ashai takes his place, this detail is crucial. It shows that in rabbitic Jewish thought, power is never absolute. Even Solomon, the symbol of wisdom and order, can fall when he forgets his limits. Ashdai does not win because he is stronger, but because Solomon grows too confident in his ability to control chaos. The narrative is therefore not an epic of heroism, but a moral warning. In several passages, Ashai even voices claims that sound disturbingly reasonable. He speaks of the falseness of power, the distance between image and essence. And when Ashdai sits upon Solomon's throne, no one recognizes the difference immediately. This evokes a deeply human anxiety. If order rests primarily on appearance, how fragile is it? And if chaos can masquerade as order, where exactly does the boundary lie? Compared with the Testament of Solomon, where Solomon remains the active interrogator and administrator, the Talmudic tradition offers a more restrained portrait. Solomon here is not a figure of absolute control over the invisible world. He is a figure of dialogue, and in that dialogue he can fail. This reflects a distinctly rabbitic sensibility. Wisdom is not omnipotence, but the ability to recognize one's own limits. There is another important difference in how the Talmud treats the concept of demons in this tradition. Demons are not a purely dualistic force, opposed entirely to God. They are part of the created order, dangerous and difficult to manage, but not outside creation altogether. Ashai exists not to destroy the world, but to test human beings. That is why Solomon's need for Ashai in building the temple carries such a profound paradox. The highest order requires cooperation with disorder. The story also reflects a deeply Jewish view of political power. The king, however wise, is never permitted to overstep divine law. When Solomon relies too heavily on the symbolic authority of the ring and forgets humility before God, he loses everything. Ashmedai, as the usurper, becomes a mirror, reflecting that danger back at him from the perspective of intellectual history. The Ashai tradition serves as a bridge between the Bible and later magical traditions. It retains the image of the ring and authority over invisible forces, yet it adds something that early modern grimoires often diminish: moral peril. To control disorder always carries the possibility of being consumed by it. This is why, when early modern texts, such as the Lamiton or Ars Goetia, portray Solomon as the figure who completely dominates 72 beings, they omit a crucial part of Jewish tradition in the Talmud. Solomon is not the symbol of total victory. He is the symbol of an enduring tension between order and disorder. Ashai is not eliminated. He is placed within a complex relationship to human authority, seen from a distance. The Solomon Ashmedai narrative is not only about demons or myth. It speaks to a strikingly modern problem. What happens when human beings believe they have fully mastered the systems they created? When power becomes mere form, when symbol replaces substance, order itself can be seized. Ashai, as the one who impersonates Solomon, embodies that fear by the end of this chapter. We recognize that rabbinic Jewish tradition contributes an essential moral depth to Solomon's image. Before Solomon became in European grimoires a symbol of lists, ranks, and systematic control, he was already the protagonist of a cautionary tale. No one, not even the wisest, can control disorder without paying a price. In the next chapter, we will leave the world of rabbinic debate and move into medieval Europe, where these stories are gathered, rewritten, and transformed into books known as grimoires. There, Solomon's image will continue to change, and Ashadai and other beings will gradually lose their moral complexity, becoming entries in a new system, the system of lists, rituals, and the power of writing. When the story leaves the world of the Talmud and rabbinic traditions, it does not disappear. On the contrary, it changes form. The fragments surrounding Solomon, the ring, and invisible forces are gradually drawn into an entirely new environment. Medieval Europe, where writing itself became one of the most powerful forms of authority human beings had ever possessed. Here Solomon is no longer remembered primarily as a moral figure or a cautionary example, but as a name that guarantees secret knowledge, and the books that bear his name come to be known by a single term: grimoires. The word grimoire derives from grammare, grammar. This origin is far from accidental in medieval society. Literacy itself was a rare form of power. The vast majority of the population could not read or write. Written language belonged to monasteries, cathedral schools, and learned elites. A book, especially one written in Latin or Greek, did not merely contain information. It represented intellectual authority. Grimoires, therefore, were not simply books of magic, but symbols of the idea that the world, including the invisible world, could be governed through writing. It is crucial to emphasize that grimoires did not emerge in a vacuum. They arose in a society saturated with anxiety. Plague, war, famine, and death were ever present. As social order was continually threatened, the need for systems that could explain and control reality became urgent. Grimoires responded to that need by promising that the world, however complex and dangerous, could still be recorded, classified, and commanded. Within this context, the name Solomon carried exceptional weight. Scripture had already established Solomon as a symbol of wisdom and order. Jewish tradition had extended that image into the realm of engagement with chaos. When medieval authors sought a symbolic patron for texts dealing with invisible forces, Solomon was the perfect choice. Attributing a book to Solomon was not simply an act of deception. It was a way of declaring that what was written belonged to an ancient and legitimate tradition of wisdom. Yet medieval grimoires also transformed the spirit of earlier traditions. Whereas the Testament of Solomon functioned as an open text, interrogative and explanatory, grimoire aimed at standardization and control. The invisible world in these books is no longer fluid. It is organized into lists, hierarchies, and clearly defined functions. The entities described resemble officials within an unseen bureaucracy, each with a name, authority, and sphere of influence. This mirrors medieval social organization itself, power layered hierarchically, laws written down, and order maintained through systems. It is here that the book becomes an instrument of power, not because the book itself is magical, but because it creates the impression that whoever controls writing controls order. Grimoires were often copied under special conditions in monasteries, in scriptoria, by candlelight, under strict discipline. Copying was not merely a technical task, it was a cultural ritual. Each page represented time, labor, and concentration, and these factors intensified the book's symbolic value. Another key point is that grimoires were not intended for the masses. They were presented as knowledge for the prepared, for those who possessed understanding. This created a clear boundary between those who knew and those who did not. In medieval society, where power was often justified through theology and learning, possession of a secret book meant standing closer to the center of authority. Grimoires thus functioned both as products of anxiety and as tools for reinforcing a stratified social order. Compared with rabbinic tradition, grimoires also blur the element of moral warning. In the Ashdai narrative, Solomon's power is always fragile and reversible. But in many grimoires, Solomon is portrayed as a model of absolute control. Invisible beings rarely resist or overturn authority. They exist to obey. This is no coincidence. It reflects a medieval longing for stability, a desire for a world in which everything, including chaos, has a fixed place. Another important factor is the materiality of the book itself. Grimoires were often kept closed, sometimes chained to desks in libraries or carefully hidden away. The physical object of the book evoked danger and power. Reading became an act of transgression, not only intellectual but moral. This contributed to the aura surrounding grimoires. They did not merely speak about power, they embodied it. It is within this environment that the scattered elements of earlier traditions, Solomon, the ring, invisible entities, begin to be gathered and systematized. Grimoires show little concern for textual origins or internal contradictions. What matters to them is usability. The invisible world must be clear, consistent, and searchable. This marks a crucial shift from story to catalogue, from narrative tradition to enumerative thinking. Yet something significant is lost in this shift. When the invisible world is framed within lists and diagrams, it loses the ethical and human depth present in Jewish tradition. The entities are no longer lessons about the limits of power. They become objects to be managed. Solomon, once a figure balanced between wisdom and humility, is gradually transformed into a symbol of technical domination. This chapter thus marks a major turning point in the journey of the 72 demons. They are no longer metaphorical expressions of illness, desire, or social instability. They become entries in a book, and once fear is written as an entry, It can be copied, circulated, and eventually misunderstood in ways earlier traditions never anticipated. In the next chapter, we will encounter a key figure in this transformation. Johann Wehr, a man who sought to demystify fear of witchcraft, while inadvertently helping to shape the lists of invisible beings for future generations. There we will see more clearly the central paradox of grimoires. Books written to control fear sometimes become the very means by which fear survives longer in the human imagination. In the mid-6th century, as Europe was engulfed in waves of witch hunts, a figure emerged who seemed to move against the current of his age. Johann Wehr was neither a monk nor a magician. He was a physician trained in the humanist spirit of the Renaissance, a former student of Cornelius Agria, and a witness to trials in which poor women, the elderly, and those deemed deviant, were tortured to death in the name of sacred order. It was within this context that Wehr wrote the major work of his life, the prestigious Demonium, 1563, on the illusions of demons. Wehr's intention, if the text is read carefully, was to demystify. He argued that most people accused of witchcraft had not entered into pacts with demons at all, but were suffering from mental illness, neurological disorders, or religiously induced obsessions. As a physician, Wehr maintained that behaviors interpreted as possession required treatment, not punishment. In an age when torture was considered a legitimate means of extracting truth, this position was revolutionary. Wehr did not deny the existence of demons within the Christian framework, but he rejected the claim that ordinary human beings could wield supernatural powers as alleged by the courts. History, however, often unfolds through unforeseen paradoxes in order to refute fanaticism. Wehr took a step that appeared entirely reasonable. He systematized in the appendix to the prestigious Demonium. He presented a catalogue of invisible beings, assigning them names, functions, ranks, and spheres of authority. This appendix became known as Pseudo-Monarchia Daemonum, the false monarchy of demons. The title Pseudo-Monarchia reveals Wehr's intention. He sought to demonstrate that the so-called kingdom of demons was illusory, a product of exaggerated imagination, by listing and describing these entities in detail. He aimed to strip them of their power, much as a natural philosopher classifies phenomena in order to remove their aura of mystery. What Wehr could not control, however, was how his work would be received. In Pseudo-Monarchia Daemonum, Wehr enumerates approximately 69 entities, each with a name, a noble title, and a particular specialty. This mode of presentation is directly inherited from medieval grimoires. The invisible world is organized as a court, mirroring the political structures of feudal Europe. There are kings, princes, dukes, and maresses. This was not accidental. It was the most familiar language of power available to contemporary readers. When chaos is clothed in administrative hierarchy, it becomes easier to imagine and easier to discuss. The problem lay in how many readers approached Wehr's work. They did not read it for his critical argument. They read the list. In a society where literacy was rare and books carried inherent authority, such a detailed catalogue was quickly detached from its original purpose. Pseudo-Archia Daemonum began to circulate independently, copied on its own, quoted selectively, and gradually treated as a reference source rather than a warning. A text written to reduce fear inadvertently supplied a vocabulary for fear itself. This illustrates a crucial mechanism in the history of knowledge. Systematization is always double-edged. Naming, classifying, and ordering can deepen understanding, but it also creates the impression that what is classified is stable and real. In the case of Pseudo-Monarchia Daemonum, enumeration gave invisible entities what appeared to be fixed addresses within the collective imagination. They were no longer flexible metaphors for illness or desire. They became entries. Another notable aspect is Wehr's retention of Solomon as a guarantor of authority. Although his goal was demystification, Wehr remained within the Solomonic tradition. This reflects the limits of his intellectual context. Even in critique, he required an ancient authority for his arguments to be heard. Solomon, long associated with wisdom and order, continued to serve as the symbolic sponsor of discussions about the invisible world. This underscores the enduring power of Solomon's image, strong enough to outlive even the author's intentions. Compared to medieval grimoires, Pseudo-Monarchia Daemonum contains a subtle difference. It diminishes the role of humans. Vi repeatedly emphasizes that human beings possess no real power over invisible forces, and that confessions extracted during witch trials are largely products of torture and delusion. Yet when the catalogue is read apart from its medical and humanist framework, this message fades. What remains is the skeleton of a system, one sturdy enough for later authors to fill with new interpretations. Historically, Pseudo-Monarchia Daemonum became a crucial intermediary between medieval, tradition, and early modern texts, such as the Lemagedon. Many names and descriptions in the Ars Goetia draw directly from Var's list. Even as the number is adjusted and the structure reorganized, here we encounter a profound paradox. A man who sought to protect victims of fear inadvertently shaped the language of fear for generations to come. This chapter, therefore, is not only about a book, but about the responsibility of knowledge. Vaya believed that by bringing reason and medicine into dialogue with religious belief, he could help end the bloody persecutions of his time. In part, he succeeded. His work influenced later opponents of witch hunts. Yet, the classificatory structure he employed lived a second life, one beyond his control from a broader perspective. Pseudo-Monarchia Daemonum marks the moment when the invisible world entered its encyclopedic phase. It was listed, numbered, and presented as knowledge that could be consulted. This laid the groundwork for the later appeal of the number 72, a number suggesting completeness, closure, and system. Wire did not create the 72 demons, but he opened the path to the idea that the invisible world could and should be contained within a finite list. As we close this chapter, one point must be kept firmly in mind. The history of the 72 demons is not a history of darkness alone, but a history of reason confronting fear. Johann Weyer represents a moment when humans began to say, perhaps the problem lies not with demons, but with how we understand ourselves. Yet because he chose the language of lists and systems, his legacy became ambivalent, at once profoundly humanistic and potentially dangerous. In the next chapter, we will enter the phase in which this system becomes fully standardized. From Bayer's list of 69, 17th-century authors would add, subtract, and reorganize until a new number emerged, 72, and with it the most famous text of all, the Lame, especially its section known as the Ars Goetia. There, the question is no longer whether demons exist, but what humans choose to do once a list has been declared complete. At this point in the journey, one conclusion has become clear. The 72 demons of Solomon are not an ancient concept preserved intact from biblical times. They are the result of a long process of transformation, moving from legend to pseudopygrial texts, to rabbitic debate, to medieval grimoires, and finally, to Johann We's attempt at demystification. Yet it was not until the 17th century that the number 72 was truly fixed, stabilized, and standardized. That moment is bound to a pivotal body of texts known as the Lammagoten, more commonly called the Lesser Key of Solomon. The Lammagoten is not a single book written by a single author. It is a compilation of multiple texts assembled and copied within the milieu of 17th century European occultism. The collection consists of 5 parts, but the most famous, and by far the most influential, is the Ars Goetia. It is here that the list of invisible entities is presented for the first time as a coherent system with a stable total of 72. It is crucial to emphasize that the Ars Goetia did not emerge in isolation. It directly inherits the list of 69 entities from Jan Ver's Pseudo-Monarchia Daemonum, but it does not simply reproduce it. The anonymous compilers of the Lemmetin added removed and reorganized entries to create a new system, one that appeared more complete by the standards of their time. This was not an arbitrary act. It reflected a distinctly early modern intellectual need, the desire for systemic completeness. By the 17th century, Europe was entering an era in which science, classification, and measurement were becoming intellectual ideals. Encyclopedias, botanical catalogues, and astronomical tables all aimed to describe the world as a totality that could be enumerated within occult thought. The invisible world was not exempt from this trend. The Ars Goetia can therefore be read as a kind of dark encyclopedia. Each entity is assigned a name, a rank, a function, and a precise position within an overarching order. Why then 72? First, it must be stated clearly. There is no solid historical evidence that the number 72 in the Ars Goetia reflects an ancient, metaphysical reality. Rather, it is a symbolic number, one that held particular appeal within Western religious and occult thought. 72 conveys a sense of completeness without being unwieldy, large enough to encompass the entire invisible world, yet small enough to be recorded and controlled through writing. In Jewish mystical tradition, the number 72 is associated with the Shem HaMaporesh, the 72 names of God, derived from verses in the Book of Exodus. However, the connection between these 72 sacred names and the 72 entities of the Arsuia is not explicit in the original texts. Most scholars regard this as a later symbolic alignment, developed when occult writers sought to create symmetry. If there are 72 divine names, then there might also be 72 opposing forces in the invisible realm. This is not Jewish doctrine, but rather the symbolic reasoning of early modern Europe. Beyond this, the number 72 appears in other systems of knowledge, astronomical cycles, geometric divisions of the circle, and astrological calculations. In that context, choosing 72 was less a claim to truth than an act of intellectual aesthetics. It made the system appear balanced, closed, and therefore more convincing to its readers. The fundamental difference between the Ars Goetia and earlier traditions lies in its commitment to standardization. If the Testament of Solomon was an open interrogative text, if the Talmudic tradition was a moral cautionary tale, and if Pseudo-Monarchia Daemonum was a classificatory effort aimed at demystification, then the Ars Goetia fully embraces the logic of the list. The invisible world here is no longer dialogical or flexible. It is fixed into a schema. Each entity becomes an entry existing to be named and categorized. Throughout this process, Solomon continues to function as a symbol of authority. The Lamitin is attributed to Solomon not for historical reasons, but for symbolic ones. Solomon represents wisdom powerful enough to encompass both the visible and invisible worlds. Yet unlike the Solomon of Jewish tradition, the Solomon of the Ars Goetia is no longer fragile. He is not overthrown, nor does he fail before chaos. He becomes a symbol of total control, an image perfectly aligned with early modern Europe's longing for order. Here, a significant trade-off becomes visible. Once the invisible world is framed as 72 discrete entries, it becomes easier to transmit. Lists can be copied, printed, memorized, but in the process, the ethical depth and moral warning present in earlier traditions are largely lost. Entities that once represented illness, obsession, or the limits of human power are transformed into technical objects within a system. This transformation helps explain the enduring appeal of the Ars Goetia. It emerged at a moment when people believed that everything could be systematized. Just as early modern science sought to classify nature, early modern occultism sought to classify chaos. In that context, the number 72 was not a discovery, but a declaration. The invisible world has been fully accounted for. Yet this declaration raises a deeper question. If everything has been listed, what remains outside the list? The Ars Goetia offers no answer. It assumes that the list is sufficient, and it is precisely this assumption that allowed the text to become a foundation for countless later interpretations, scholarly, occult, and cultural. As this chapter closes, what matters is not the names of the 72 entities, but the historical moment they represent. The Lame Megatin and the Ars Goetia mark the point at which humans believed chaos could be packaged. The number 72 stands as a symbol of that belief, one both ambitious and illusory. In the next chapter, we will not examine each name individually. Instead, we will ask a more fundamental question. What do these 72 entities represent in human life? Read as a social mirror. What fears, desires, and obsessions of early modern Europe does the list reveal? And why, after centuries, do they continue to haunt the modern imagination? When the Ars Goetia completes the act of framing the invisible world into 72 entities, it does more than produce a list. It inadvertently leaves later generations a psychological map, one in which the deepest fears of early modern Europe are recorded in names, ranks, and stories read slowly and returned to its historical context. We begin to see that each demon does not exist in isolation. They are living metaphors for the anxieties people of that era faced every day: power, violence, and the fear of order collapsing. In a Europe repeatedly plunged into religious wars and dynastic conflict, the greatest fear was not abstract evil, but power without restraint. When political order is fragile, what terrifies is not the darkness outside, but the possibility that human beings can become brutal, the moment brutality is permitted in that setting. Many entities in the Ars Goetia are described not as chaotic monsters, but as rulers of an invisible realm: kings, dukes, generals, commanders, titles that were immediately legible in a feudal society. The demons in this category often do nothing outwardly strange. They do not spread disease or tempt people with forbidden knowledge. Instead, they agitate human beings, igniting aggression, inflating ambition, planting suspicion among allies, or turning simmering resentment into open rebellion. This is not random fantasy. It is a direct reflection of collective memory. Civil wars, besieged cities, armies speaking the language of faith while acting like plunderers. In stories shaped around this group, violence rarely appears as a purely personal impulse. It is depicted as a wave moving from one person to another, a whisper, an incitement, an invisible influence, and the crowd changes. That description reveals an early modern fear at its core. War does not begin with reason, but with the contagious spread of emotion. By personifying violence as an invisible entity society. Once the lists of the Ars Goetia had been standardized, a natural question arose in the early modern imagination. How can an entity be held by writing? The answer did not come from prayer or violence, but from symbol. Sigils and seals appear precisely at that intersection where people believed that form could carry authority, and that a sign, if drawn correctly, could stand in for the presence of power. First, something must be clarified in grimoires. A sigil is not a charm in the popular folk sense. It is a graphic language of authority. In the medieval and early modern world, where law, ownership, and jurisdiction were confirmed by seals, it was easy to assume the invisible world followed the same logic. A document without a seal is invalid. A command without a recognized emblem is not acknowledged. Once this administrative logic was extended to the invisible realm, the sigil became a kind of signature, not of a human being, but of fear itself. Once fear had been named, the history of seals long predates grimoires. In ancient civilizations, seals were used to authenticate state power, legalize transactions, and mark juridical boundaries. When a king impressed his seal, his authority was present indirectly wherever that seal appeared. Grimoires inherit this exact concept. Solomon did not need to appear in person. The seal of Solomon was sufficient to impose order. For that reason, the sigils assigned to each entity were not designed primarily to summon, but to locate those entities within a system of legitimate authority. What is striking is that sigils are not illustrative images. They rarely depict shape or face. Instead, they consist of abstract lines, sometimes resembling compressed writing, sometimes resembling a diagram. That abstraction reflects a deep assumption. Authority does not need to resemble what it controls. It only needs to be recognized. A royal seal does not look like a king, yet it carries the king's force. Sigils operate on the same principle. In the Lamadin, each entity is linked to a distinct sigil. This has a powerful psychological effect. When fear is drawn into a form, it loses its infinity. It gains borders, structure, and the possibility of being copied. A sigil, therefore, does not merely represent power. It tames fear by turning fear into shape. just as a map tames wild space. A sigil tames the dark territories of imagination. But sigils do not exist alone. They are always accompanied by a seal above all, the Seal of Solomon. Across different manuscripts, its design varies, but its meaning remains consistent. It is a symbol of legitimate authority. This reveals a crucial point in early modern thought. Power over the invisible world does not originate in the individual, but in the individual's position within a recognized tradition. Solomon is the name that guarantees that tradition. From a cultural perspective, sigils reflect an important shift in how people understood writing. In earlier periods, writing served primarily to tell stories and preserve records by the age of grimoires. Writing and the shape of writing was believed to possess efficacy in itself. A sign does not merely signify it does something. This is a shift from descriptive language to performative language. A shift that early modern society was also experiencing in law, science, and technology. Yet, it is precisely here that a fragile boundary is crossed. When sigils are treated as instruments of action, they can be detached from ethical context. In rabbinic tradition, authority is always accompanied by warnings about limits. But in many grimoires, the sigil is presented as a neutral technique. Draw it correctly, and that is enough. This reflects a distinctly modern anxiety when technique advances faster than ethics. Tools can be used without reflection on consequences. Another point that must be emphasized is the materiality of sigils. They exist on parchment, ink, books, objects that can be hidden, passed from hand to hand, or prohibited in medieval society, where books were scarce and controlled. Owning a grimoire filled with sigils created the sensation of access to forbidden power. This contributed to the dangerous aura surrounding such symbols. The sigil did not only represent invisible authority, it also represented the authority of secret knowledge. Seen in retrospect, sigils and seals tell us less about invisible entities than about how early, modern people understood power. They believed power could be packaged into form, that order could be held by a sign, and that whoever possessed the symbol possessed at least, in part, reality itself. It is the same logic that produced the rule of law, measurable science and modern administration, only applied to a different object. For that reason, when we look at sigils today, what matters is not their specific shapes, but the spirit behind them. Sigils are evidence that when confronted with chaos, people chose to draw boundaries rather than turn away. Even if those boundaries were illusory, they still reveal something profoundly human. The effort to turn fear into something visible, tangible, and at least within imagination, controllable. After tracing the entire journey through the Bible, rabbinic tradition, medieval grimoires, Johann Wehr, the Lamegatan, the Ars Goetia, and the world of sigils, the final question is no longer who are the 72 demons, but what do they reflect? At this point, the scholarly answer becomes clearer than ever. The 72 demons are not an ancient metaphysical legacy preserved intact since the time of Solomon, nor a single unified system transmitted without interruption. They are the product of centuries of layered thought in which human societies repeatedly sought to name their own fears in order to believe those fears could be understood, managed, and restrained. When we return to the textual origins, one fact stands out with particular clarity. There are no 72 demons in the Bible, no fixed list in classical Judaism, and no orthodox Christian doctrine that affirms such a system. What emerges gradually is not demons themselves, but the habit of enumeration. As Europe entered an era in which writing, administration, law, and classification became the foundations of social order, the invisible world was drawn into the same logic. Chaos was no longer narrated through stories. It was framed through lists. In that context, 72 was not a discovery, but a cultural declaration that what could not be controlled might nevertheless be enclosed within a finite number. For this reason, each entity in the Ruatia should not be read as a separate supernatural character, but as a fragment of early modern human experience. Unchecked power, collective violence, betrayal, greed, desire, psychological exhaustion, forbidden knowledge. These were all tangible realities of 16th and 17th century Europe. The difference lies only in language before the emergence of science, psychology, and social theory. People spoke through symbols. They called what exceeded their explanatory reach demons, not in order to worship them, but in order to speak at all. The most significant transformation in the formation of the 72 demons lies in the shift from ethics to technique. In earlier traditions, especially in the Solomon Ashdai narrative, power over chaos was always accompanied by warnings about limits and humility. By the time of the Ars Goetia, that power is presented as a neutral system. Names, sigils, hierarchies. Once tools are separated from the question of whether they should be used, the illusion of control emerges. This is not merely a problem of occultism, it is a problem intrinsic to modern thought itself. At their deepest level, sigils and seals are not spells, but forms of collective psychological coping. They transform invisible fear into shape, uncertainty into lines and symbols. Lists and signs do not eliminate chaos, but they allow people to coexist with chaos without collapse. Just as maps do not erase deserts, sigils do not erase fear. They merely make fear less boundless. For this reason, it is unsurprising that the 72 demons continue to persist in modern culture. They appear in novels, games, films, music, and social media, not because contemporary society believes in demons, but because we still rely on symbols to speak about power, desire, and insecurity. The old names endure because they have been detached from their original religious frameworks and have become a cultural language. If a single conclusion must be drawn, it is this: the 72 demons do not tell a story about hell. They tell a story about humanity at moments of historical anxiety. They reveal how societies confront fear, how authority is legitimized, and how writing simultaneously liberates and confines the imagination. When we look at them, the important question is not, are they real, but what do they reveal about us now? For every era has its own 72 demons. Only their names change. And perhaps the most frightening moment is not when darkness is named, but when we believe we have named it all, and therefore no longer need to question ourselves. As this story closes, it leaves not fear, but a quiet mirror, one in which darkness from beginning to end has always borne the shape of humanity. The 72 demons we have just journeyed through, after all, do not stand outside humanity. They stand within history, within fear, ambition, desire, and the deeply human attempts to control the world. When the world becomes too uncertain, they do not ask you to believe. They only ask you to look again. If you are listening to this video at night, perhaps in a quiet room, take a moment to ask yourself which fear in this story felt the most familiar to you. Uncontrolled power, collective violence, or the feeling that the world is moving faster than human understanding can keep up with. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and it is your perspectives that will shape the journeys this channel takes next. If these stories of history and mythology help you see the world more deeply, more slowly, and more clearly, consider clicking follow or subscribe so we can continue walking together through many more long nights where history is not only retold, but re-understood. Wishing you a peaceful night, and thank you for staying with me until the very last moment.